There is one photograph circulating across diplomatic circles this morning that no analyst in Washington predicted would exist. Two national flags hanging side by side inside a ceremonial hall. Not the American stars and stripes, not standing alongside the familiar maple leaf, but the saffron, white, and green of India positioned next to the red and white of Canada. This image was captured in New Delhi on a quiet Tuesday morning in March 2026, and the entire Western foreign policy establishment is still trying to process what it means. Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stood facing each other, exchanged a firm handshake, and placed their signatures on a document that had been secretly constructed through 18 months of covert diplomatic channels. And here is the detail that separates this from every other bilateral agreement signed this decade. This was not merely a trade arrangement. This was a strategic declaration. In the careful, measured language that international diplomacy demands, this document effectively announced to the world, we have found an alternative partner. At precisely 9:47 a.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, March 10, 2026, the planet's most populous democracy and one of America's nearest geographic allies formally executed the most dramatic bilateral realignment in modern Canadian diplomatic history. They titled it the Canada-India Comprehensive Economic and Strategic Partnership. A sweeping $67 billion architecture encompassing trade flows, military cooperation, advanced technology sharing, and critical mineral supply chain integration. Every single one of those domains was, until approximately 6 months prior, considered firmly within America's exclusive strategic territory. Now, let me ask you something that I genuinely think deserves an honest answer. When was the last time a G7 nation, not a developing country, not a middle power looking for leverage, but a full member of the world's most exclusive economic club, deliberately and publicly restructured its core economic relationships away from Washington, not pivoting toward Beijing, not aligning with Moscow, toward New Delhi? That is what makes this morning historically unprecedented. While the United States was occupied with broadcasting the message that Canada needs America more than America needs Canada, India was conducting an entirely different kind of conversation with Ottawa, a conversation built not on threats and leverage, but on opportunity and mutual strategic interest. And Canada accepted that invitation with both hands open. Throughout this special investigation, we are going to dismantle exactly what was formalized in New Delhi this morning. We are going to examine the individual agreements buried within this broader partnership, the specific provisions that should genuinely alarm every American manufacturer operating in the battery sector, every American farmer exporting grain to the Indo-Pacific region, every American energy company that assumed its dominance in LNG markets was permanent. We are going to reconstruct precisely how Donald Trump's escalating tariff threats, his provocative rhetoric about absorbing Canada as a 51st state, and his deliberate public degradation of Canadian political leadership manufactured a 17-month diplomatic vacuum that India's foreign ministry filled with calculated, almost surgical precision. And we are going to confront the single most important question that apparently nobody inside the current administration has bothered to formulate, let alone answer, when your nearest neighbor, your largest trading partner, your closest geographic ally begins actively searching for a replacement relationship. What does that reality signal about the durability of American strategic primacy? Settle in and pay close attention. The architecture of global power alignment is being reconstructed while most Americans are not even watching. To genuinely comprehend the magnitude of what occurred in New Delhi, you need to rewind to February 2025. That was the precise moment when Donald Trump, during an Oval Office meeting that was broadcast live across every major American television network, sat directly across from Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who was visibly rigid with tension, and delivered a line that would eventually reshape the geopolitical landscape of the Western Hemisphere. With a calculated smile that carried absolutely zero warmth behind it, Trump declared, "Canada needs us more than we need Canada. That is simply a fact." He delivered that sentence the way a property owner addresses a tenant who has fallen dangerously behind on payments. Dismissive, conclusive. The words were engineered not to open a negotiation, but to close one, by humiliation. Financial markets registered the moment immediately. Diplomatic channels across multiple continents buzzed with analysis. But the most consequential reaction occurred in a very specific government office situated along Akbar Road in central New Delhi. India's Ministry of External Affairs had been monitoring the progressive deterioration of the Canada-United States relationship for well over 12 months before that Oval Office moment. They maintained their own complicated and deeply strained history with Ottawa. The 2023 diplomatic crisis surrounding the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar had driven a severe wedge between the two governments, creating what multiple diplomats privately described as the coldest bilateral freeze in decades. But India's foreign policy apparatus operates with a patience that few Western capitals truly appreciate. And within Trump's dismissive February 2025 remarks, they identified a strategic opening that might never present itself again within an entire generation. The confidential back-channel negotiations commenced in April 2025, and they did not travel through conventional ambassadorial pathways. Instead, they moved through a private intermediary, a Canadian-born investment banker based in Singapore named Arjun Rai, according to three individuals with direct knowledge of the discussions who provided information to the Financial Times under strict conditions of anonymity. Rai possessed established relationships on both sides of the negotiating table. He had previously served as an advisory figure to the Trudeau government on Indo-Pacific strategic policy. Crucially, he had also spent 7 years embedded within Tata Consultancy Services operations in Mumbai. He functioned as the invisible bridge connecting two capitals, and for 6 continuous months, not a single individual within the Washington foreign policy establishment was aware that this bridge even existed. The Trump administration had committed 3 catastrophic strategic miscalculations during this period. The first, they operated under the assumption that Canada possessed no viable alternative partnerships. The second, they presumed that India was far too consumed by its own internal political dynamics to design and execute a major diplomatic realignment. And the third miscalculation, which proved to be the most consequential of all 3, they assumed that tariffs communicated the same message to every recipient. Canada interpreted those tariffs through an entirely different lens. Canada interpreted them as definitive confirmation that the foundational character of the relationship had been permanently altered, and Canada responded with corresponding permanence. Now let us examine the precise structural architecture of what was formally signed this morning, because this is where the conversation shifts from diplomatic symbolism to concrete strategic consequences. This partnership is not a loosely worded aspirational framework. This is not a memorandum of understanding destined to accumulate dust inside some forgotten filing cabinet in Ottawa's bureaucratic corridors. This is a legally binding 5-part agreement, and each individual component was specifically engineered to substitute something that Canada currently sources from or channels through the United States. The first component is the Critical Minerals Supply Chain Accord. Canada possesses the largest lithium reserves anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. India is simultaneously constructing the fastest expanding electric vehicle manufacturing ecosystem on the planet, projected to produce 11 million EVs annually by 2030, according to data published by the International Energy Agency in January of this year. Until this morning, the operating assumption throughout Washington's policy circles was that Canadian lithium would naturally flow southward, processed through American facilities, powering American battery manufacturing plants. That assumption is now fighting for survival. Under the terms of this morning's agreement, Canada will export unprocessed lithium, cobalt, and nickel directly to Indian processing facilities located in Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, not routed through American intermediaries, not channeled through American port infrastructure, directly. Have you ever stopped to consider what happens to an entire industrial strategy when the raw materials it depends upon suddenly find a different destination? The U.S. Department of Energy has calculated that Canadian lithium deposits alone represent a value of $340 billion over the next 2 decades. India has just secured a first-mover position within that supply chain architecture. Washington received a Tuesday morning surprise that nobody in the administration had prepared for. The second component is the Technology and AI Cooperation Framework. This is the specific section that will deprive Silicon Valley executives of sleep tonight. Canada has quietly and methodically established itself as one of the 3 premier artificial intelligence research hubs anywhere on the planet. The Vector Institute, headquartered in Toronto, and the Mila Institute, operating from Montreal. These are not secondary operations running at the margins of the field. These are world-class institutions that produce Geoffrey Hinton, Yoshua Bengio, and an entire generation of machine learning researchers whose intellectual contributions constructed the very foundation upon which today's AI economy operates. India's technology sector, which currently employs 5.4 million people and contributes 9.4% of national GDP, according to the National Association of Software and Service Companies, possesses an enormous appetite for precisely the kind of research capability that Canada offers. And as of this morning, they have a formalized institutional pathway to access it. Joint research laboratories, accelerated visa processing for Indian engineers transferring to Canadian institutions, shared computational data infrastructure. Every single one of these collaborative mechanisms was previously assumed to flow exclusively through American universities, American technology corporations, American institutional intermediaries. That assumption was pronounced dead this morning in New Delhi. The third component is the Defense Industrial Base Partnership, and this is the section where the American national security establishment should be directing its most concentrated attention, though it almost certainly is not doing so with adequate urgency. Canada operates as a Five Eyes intelligence partner. Canada shares access to the most sensitive classified information that circulates anywhere within the Western security architecture. Canada has, throughout the entire duration of the Cold War and every subsequent decade, been functionally embedded within the American defense industrial base at a level of integration that most civilians never fully appreciate. Canadian defense contractors manufacture components that are installed inside American fighter aircraft, American naval vessels, American missile guidance systems. Under the terms of this morning's agreement, Canada has formally committed to establishing a parallel defense industrial partnership with India, concentrated specifically in three domains: maritime surveillance technology, unmanned aerial vehicle manufacturing, and satellite communication systems. India's defense budget for the current fiscal year reached $73 billion. That budget is expanding at 13% annually, making it one of the fastest-growing military expenditure programs on Earth. Canada just positioned itself as India's preferred Western technology partner for absorbing and directing that growth. Those are contracts, revenue streams, and layers of strategic integration that Washington had treated as permanently secured within the American orbit. They are no longer secured in any meaningful sense. The fourth component is the agricultural trade reorientation. Canada ranks as the world's third-largest wheat exporter by volume. India, despite maintaining its own enormous agricultural production capacity, experiences periodic wheat deficits and has been actively working to diversify its import relationships ever since the 2022 global food price shock destabilized supply chains across South and Southeast Asia. The tariffs that Trump imposed on Canadian agricultural exports beginning in March 2025, averaging 18.7% according to the published schedule from the United States Trade Representative's Office, effectively forced Canadian grain producers to search urgently for alternative buyers. They located one. India agreed this morning to a 10-year agricultural purchase commitment valued at $8.2 billion. Canadian farmers operating across the provinces of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, communities that voted overwhelmingly conservative in the most recent federal election, populations that consider themselves broadly aligned with Trump's political movement and ideological worldview, are this morning the direct financial beneficiaries of an agreement that exists entirely because Trump's tariff policies pushed Canadian agriculture to seek markets beyond the American border. That is the savage irony that absolutely nobody within the White House communications operation will articulate publicly. The fifth component is the Energy Transition Compact. Canada has developed liquefied natural gas export infrastructure positioned on both its Pacific and Atlantic coastlines. India has committed under its revised Paris Agreement obligations to reducing coal dependency by 40% before 2032. The underlying arithmetic here requires no advanced degree to comprehend. Canada possesses abundant natural gas reserves and export capacity. India requires massive volumes of natural gas to execute its energy transition. The United States had spent 3 years under the Biden administration cultivating its position as India's preferred LNG supplier for precisely this transition. Trump's energy policy pivot, specifically his withdrawal from cooperative multilateral energy frameworks and his insistence on purely transactional approaches to energy diplomacy, introduced a level of ambiguity into long-term supply arrangements that India finds fundamentally incompatible with its planning requirements. India does not tolerate ambiguity when making energy commitments that span decades. Canada offered what India values above almost everything else in energy partnerships: certainty. A 15-year LNG supply agreement anchored to the newly expanded LNG Canada terminal facility in Kitimat, British Columbia, carrying a projected value of $41 billion across the full contract period. And here is where the full strategic weight of this morning's events becomes impossible to dismiss or minimize. Calculate those figures together: lithium supply chain commitments, technology cooperation frameworks, defense industrial partnerships, agricultural purchase agreements, energy supply contracts. The combined total represents a structured, multi-sector strategic relationship that collectively redirects somewhere between $160 and $200 billion in economic activity over the coming decade. Economic activity that Washington had assumed, not through competitive diplomacy, not through attractive partnership offers, not through careful relationship maintenance, but through pure, unexamined assumption, would remain permanently anchored within the American economic orbit. The White House response arrived at 11:23 a.m. Eastern Time. A written statement from the press secretary characterized the India-Canada agreement as a routine bilateral arrangement between two friendly nations and noted that the United States maintains its own robust and productive partnerships with both India and Canada independently. That statement contained 9 sentences. It referenced no specific countermeasures. It proposed no emergency diplomatic engagement with either Ottawa or New Delhi. It announced no tariff revisions, no policy reviews, no interagency assessment process. It was, by every available measure, the response of an administration that had been caught entirely without preparation and had not yet determined what its position should be. Sources positioned inside the State Department, and I want to be deliberately precise about this characterization, 3 mid-level career diplomats who provided statements to Reuters this morning described the internal atmosphere as what they termed controlled panic. One individual employed the specific phrase self-inflicted wound. Another revealed what constitutes the most critical operational detail in this entire story, that American embassies stationed in both Ottawa and New Delhi had been transmitting classified cables to Washington for 11 consecutive months, warning with increasing urgency that the Canada-India back channel was active, progressing, and approaching formalization. 11 months of documented warnings flowing into the capital. The question now circulating through very quiet conference rooms along C Street is devastatingly simple. Who received those cables, who read them, and what action was taken in response? The Trump administration has operated since January 2025 under a theory of economic leverage that follows a straightforward internal logic. America is so economically massive, so structurally central, so fundamentally indispensable to the functioning of the global trading system that no rational actor would voluntarily choose to reduce their dependence upon it. The theory is not inherently irrational, it carries genuine historical support. Throughout most of the post-war period, that proposition was simply an accurate description of reality. The fundamental problem is that this theory assumes the psychological costs of dependence remain within tolerable limits. When dependence transforms into experienced humiliation, and when the most powerful nation on earth publicly ridicules its neighbor's structural vulnerability, the internal calculus within the dependent nation undergoes a profound transformation. Countries begin performing strategic mathematics they had previously refused to consider, and when they complete those calculations, they sometimes discover that alternatives possess far greater viability than anyone had previously acknowledged. Canada discovered precisely that. The India relationship was not simple to construct. The Nijar assassination crisis had inflicted genuine diplomatic wounds. The bilateral downgrade of 2023 carried consequences far beyond symbolic gestures. Senior Canadian officials have privately characterized the process of rebuilding institutional trust with New Delhi as among the most demanding diplomatic exercises undertaken in recent Canadian history. They pursued it regardless. They pursued it because the alternative, perpetual dependence on a Washington that had explicitly communicated its view of Canada as a subordinate entity, had become, in the precise words of one senior Canadian official who spoke to the Globe and Mail on Background last week, psychologically untenable. Psychologically untenable. That is not the vocabulary of trade policy negotiation. That is the language of a relationship fractured at a depth that tariff adjustments and supply chain agreements cannot reach. But here is the dimension that nobody inside Washington is discussing this morning, and it is the element that elevates this story from a bilateral trade development into a structural reconfiguration of the entire American-led international order. India did not execute this agreement in isolation. On the identical day at the identical summit venue in New Delhi, Indian External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar conducted separate bilateral sessions with foreign ministers representing Australia, the United Kingdom, and the European Union Trade Commissioner. The official readouts released from all 4 meetings contained identical diplomatic language, not merely similar phrasing, but word-for-word identical formulations, referencing sovereign economic partnerships and resilient supply chains independent of single market dependency. That kind of linguistic uniformity does not emerge spontaneously from 4 independent diplomatic teams drafting separate communications. That language was coordinated in advance. That language constitutes a deliberate message. The message communicates this: the India-Canada agreement is not a standalone event. It is a replicable template, and India is explicitly presenting it as one to every significant Western economy simultaneously. The strategic implications for American economic positioning are both profound and immediate. For 4 decades, the architecture of American global primacy has depended upon what international relations scholars describe as the hub-and-spoke model. America functions as the central hub. Every other major economy connects to it through individual bilateral spokes. The strategic elegance of this configuration lies in its prevention of direct connections between spokes that would bypass the hub. Trade arrangements occur between America and Japan, America and South Korea, America and the European Union, not between Japan and South Korea independently, not between the EU and India without American institutional mediation. What happened this morning in New Delhi is that 2 significant spokes constructed a direct connection between themselves, and they executed this maneuver openly, deliberately, with full press conference presentation and cameras broadcasting globally. They are not concealing this realignment. They are advertising it because the advertisement itself carries strategic weight. The message transmitted to every other spoke throughout the system is unambiguous. Direct connections can be established, the hub cannot prevent them, and the hub may not even recognize what is happening until the structural damage is irreversible. Four American industrial sectors sit directly in the path of what was formalized this morning: battery manufacturing, semiconductor-adjacent technology development, defense component supply chains, and agricultural exports to the Indo-Pacific region. Across each of these sectors, the United States had assumed structural competitive advantages that are now materially compromised by binding international agreements. The Department of Commerce has not yet published any analytical assessment of this agreement. The Office of the United States Trade Representative has announced no formal review process. The National Security Council has not publicly convened any emergency coordination session as of this broadcast. The official American response to the most consequential geopolitical economic realignment since the establishment of the BRICS Development Bank remains 9 sentences drafted by a press secretary who demonstrably cannot correctly pronounce Jaishankar's name. Now let us examine what unfolds from here, because this is the threshold where strategic consequences become existential, not in metaphorical terms, but in structurally permanent terms that reshape American strategic positioning for decades. The Trump administration possesses 3 available response pathways. The first pathway is escalation, imposing increased tariffs on Canada, threatening expanded economic consequences, attempting to demonstrate that the costs associated with the India partnership exceed whatever benefits Ottawa anticipates. The fundamental problem with escalation is that it accelerates precisely the dynamic it seeks to arrest. Every additional measure of economic coercion that Washington applies against Ottawa renders the India alternative more strategically rational, not less. Coercive escalation produces diminishing returns when the party being pressured has already secured a functioning exit strategy. Canada now possesses exactly that. The signatures dried this morning. The second pathway is concession, quietly reducing tariff barriers, extending bilateral negotiation offers, attempting to re-anchor Canada within the American economic gravitational field through positive incentives rather than punitive threats. The obstacle confronting this approach is that it requires the Trump administration to acknowledge, either publicly or through unmistakable implication, that its tariff strategy constituted a strategic error. That is not a concession this particular administration makes with ease or speed. And every week of institutional delay represents another week during which the India-Canada supply chain infrastructure becomes more deeply physically embedded. These are not arrangements that dissolve over a single diplomatic breakfast. The critical minerals processing facilities currently under construction in Gujarat represent multi-billion-dollar physical installations with decades-long operational lifespans. Once constructed, they are permanent facts on the ground. The third pathway is the one that should generate the deepest concern for any American citizen sitting in their living room in Ohio or Arizona or Pennsylvania who maintains a retirement portfolio connected to American manufacturing performance. That pathway is paralysis. This administration possesses no coherent Indo-Pacific economic strategy. It withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2017. It declined participation in the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. It has conducted its entire diplomatic relationship with India through the personal dynamic between Trump and Modi, a dynamic that, as of this morning, appears to operate according to its own independent strategic logic that does not necessarily serve American national interests. What does Modi ultimately want? That is the question American strategic analysts have debated for 2 years running. And the honest assessment is that Modi wants precisely what every Indian leader since Nehru has pursued: strategic autonomy. The capacity to maintain proximity to America without accepting dependence, proximity to Russia without submitting to capture, proximity to China without risking absorption. The India-Canada agreement is not anti-American in its design or intent. It is non-American. And in the current geopolitical environment, non-American positioning and anti-American positioning produce functionally identical strategic outcomes for Washington. There remains one additional dimension. One final layer that transforms everything discussed throughout this analysis into something structurally permanent in a way that no White House press statement and no tariff reversal can adequately address. The demographic foundation. India's population stands at 1.44 billion people with a median age of 28 years. Canada's population is 41 million, and 1.4 million of those citizens were born in India. The Canadian Indian diaspora constitutes the largest South Asian diaspora community anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. It is economically influential, politically organized at every governmental level, and culturally connected to both nations simultaneously through dense networks of family, commerce, and institutional affiliation. This partnership is not exclusively a government-to-government transaction negotiated between foreign ministries. It represents the formal institutional recognition of a human network that already exists, already operates with enormous efficiency, and already moves capital, talent, and strategic information between the two countries at a scale that no diplomatic document creates from nothing. It merely acknowledges and dramatically accelerates what was already underway. That network is not temporary. It expands every single year. Canada absorbs between 200,000 and 350,000 Indian immigrants annually. They obtain Canadian citizenship. They participate in elections. They establish businesses that span both economies. They maintain family connections across oceans. They constitute, in the precise terminology of contemporary geopolitical analysis, a strategic demographic asset that India has been cultivating with extraordinary patience for 20 years and that America has largely failed to recognize or counter. Monitor 3 specific developments across the next 72 hours. First, observe whether the State Department schedules emergency bilateral communications with both Ottawa and New Delhi before the weekend concludes. If such calls materialize, it signals that someone within the administration comprehends the severity of what transpired this morning and is attempting damage containment. If they do not, and if the weekend passes without senior diplomatic engagement, it confirms that the administration genuinely has not grasped the strategic magnitude of what was signed, and the window for any corrective American response is rapidly closing. Second, watch the Canadian dollar. It strengthened 1.4% against the US dollar within 2 hours following the New Delhi announcement. Currency markets process information without political allegiance, without media narrative bias, without ideological filtering. A strengthening Canadian dollar relative to the American dollar on the precise day that Canada formally reoriented its strategic partnerships away from Washington constitutes the market's unvarnished verdict on which capital won this morning. Third, watch India. Specifically observe whether India's parliament ratifies this agreement through standard legislative procedures or whether Modi employs executive authority to fast-track implementation. Fast-tracking would signal that New Delhi views maintaining momentum as strategically critical, that they want supply chains operational, processing facilities under active construction, technology partnerships generating outputs before Washington manages to assemble a coherent institutional response. Fast-tracking would indicate that India believes the window during which American interference remains possible is narrow, and they fully intend to close it before Washington finishes waking up. Throughout most of American history, this country never needed to exert significant effort to maintain allied loyalty. Geography, shared ideology, deep economic interdependence, and the collective experience of confronting Soviet expansion performed that work automatically across generations. The post-Cold War order delivered a subsequent generation of automatic strategic alignment constructed upon the assumption that the American consumer market, the American military umbrella, and the American dollar were collectively irreplaceable components of any serious nation's strategic architecture. And for a sustained historical period, they were genuinely irreplaceable. That was not propaganda. That was observable reality. The question that March 10th, 2026 forces permanently onto the strategic table, the question that historians will eventually determine was the defining question of this entire era, is whether those pillars of American indispensability still hold. When your closest geographic neighbor, sharing 4,000 miles of border, sharing a common language, sharing a continent, sharing an integrated defense perimeter, sharing the longest unfortified boundary in the entire recorded history of human civilization, when that neighbor concludes that its future security and prosperity are better guaranteed through partnership with a nation positioned on the opposite side of the planet, something foundational has shifted. Not in Canada's geography, not in India's capabilities, in the perceived value of the American relationship itself. In the trust, that invisible infrastructure supporting every trade agreement, every security guarantee, every diplomatic exchange, that trust has fractured at a structural level. Trump declared that Canada needs America more. Observe carefully what India just signed. The old assumptions, as they say, no longer describe the territory. Subscribe now. This story is only beginning its first chapter because what was formalized in New Delhi this morning does not represent the conclusion of the American century, but it does mark the first morning when a serious concentration of serious strategic minds stopped assuming that century would continue indefinitely.